Hello, friends. This is part 4 of my video series that I'm doing rebutting Cold Case Christianity's page, Is Jesus a Pacifist? A little over a week ago, Hamas invaded Israel in that horrible attack. So I'm going to have to talk a little bit about that. I think when something like that happens, the pacifist voices get drowned out and the conservatives, get more power during these times. I'm going to say more about the attack in the next couple videos where I talk about where J. Warner Wallace talks about Jesus agreeing with his father's view on war, which is weird. But I did hear a reporter say something. I don't remember her name, but it struck me. She said there's two kind of people in Israel and Gaza. There are those that believe in the use of violence and those who believe violence is never justified. And I also heard a Christian suggest that if the Israelis had guns, then they would have been able to defend themselves against Hamas. Which is really ridiculous because we know with the amount of guns we have in the U.S., we have 30,000 gun deaths a year here in the U.S. and in this gun culture. That's one Hamas attack every 2 weeks, year after year after year, and we do nothing. Schools, churches, Walmarts, movie theaters, mosques, synagogues are all getting shot up, and we do nothing. Because we know in America that the gun is America's golden calf. And that's the context of J. Warner Wallace's page, I believe. I believe he made this page to comfort his conservative evangelical audience that Jesus is okay with you having a gun. Jesus is okay with us dropping bombs from drones and killing people. But it has to be said that guns are very different from swords. In this video, we're going to talk about how he says Jesus called for the use of the sword. Guns are many, many times more deadly than swords, and they can kill at a distance. It's a whole nother level of evil. In biblical times, the only sidearms available to people to use for protection were knives or swords. Today's equivalent weapons would be pistols and automatic rifles. Yeah, big difference. Jesus told his disciples to arm themselves with swords. Really? Did he? J. Warner Wallace? So let's look at the verse here. He said to them, "When I sent you without money bag, knapsack, and sandals, did you lack anything?" They said, "Nothing." Then he said to them, "But now, he who has a money bag, let him take it, and likewise a knapsack. And he who has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. For I say to you, that this which is written must still be accomplished in me. And he was numbered with the transgressors. For the things concerning me have an end." So I don't understand how J. Warner Wallace interprets this verse, or even if he even looked at it, because Jesus is saying that when he sent them out without swords, they didn't lack anything. He's saying, I'm doing this. We're going to have the money bags. We're going to have the knapsack. We're going to have the sword, to just like with the temple, because you're fulfilling prophecy. This is a prophetic act, and he's numbered with the transgressors, just like in the temple. It was, zeal for my Father's house will consume me. Anyways, he says, "Lord, look, there are 2 swords." He said to them, "It is enough. 2 for 12 people." Definitely wasn't prescriptive. We aren't supposed to be numbered with the transgressors. This is actually saying against swords. So J. Warner Wallace fails again and ignores the context He says this is, we should be, the disciples preparing for their defense. Well, what happens, J. Warner Wallace? Why don't you tell us what happens when the soldiers come to arrest Jesus and they, Lord, do you want us to use the sword? And he yells at him, enough of this. Those who draw the sword die by the sword. So how is he calling for the use of the sword for self-defense? Well, Tertullian, the father of Western theology, would disagree with Mr. Wallace. He said Christ, in disarming Peter, disarmed every soldier. And Paul would also disagree. 2 Corinthians 10:4, the weapons we fight with are not weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. In the KJV, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. So he ignores Matthew 26:52. Put your sword back in its place, Jesus said to him, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. And this here is prophecy. Some people say this is a proverb. Well, this is not a proverb. This is a curse. This is prophecy, warning the three groups of Jews at the time, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Pharisees, that if they don't change, they're going to die by the sword. And that's what happens in 70 AD. It's very important to understand in order to interpret these verses. Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of the temple, which did happen in 70 AD. And the Essenes were destroyed, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they died by the sword. In another verse, he says, no more of this. This is Jesus' last message to the church before he's arrested. And he's just going to say some proverb that everybody already believed? Really? In John 16:25, we see, though I have been speaking figuratively, a time is coming when I will no longer use the kind of language, but will tell you plainly about my Father. And the KJV says, these things have I spoken unto you in Proverbs, but the time cometh when I shall no more speak to you in Proverbs. So, the verse in Luke is not a proverb. Or the verse in Matthew 26:52. Those who draw the sword will die by the sword is not a proverb. We see here what another allusion to this in Luke 21:24. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. This is talking about the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. This is prophesying. And the New King James says, and they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive unto all nations. So what do we get from these verses? We get that the destruction is for violence. It's for the use of the sword. Just like the flood was because of violence, which I'll show later. Despite David wasn't allowed to build the temple because of all the violence he committed. Nonviolence is at the core of all the world's religions, but conservative teachers give people a theological justification for war, violence, and the preparation for violence. Isaiah 52:7. Let's look at the New King James. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who proclaims peace, who brings glad tidings of good things, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. How beautiful are the feet of him who brings the good news, who proclaims peace. And that verse is alluded to by John the Baptist's father, Zechariah, in his song. And at the end he says, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace. So alluded to in Romans 10:15, how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. And the KJV, always the better one. And how shall they preach unless they are sent? As is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, who bring glad tidings of good things. Nonviolence is at the core of Christianity. Those who live by the sword, die by the sword, is a perfect prophecy of what has happened in Israel for the last 70 years. I'll talk more about it in my next video. But J. Warner Wallace, Jesus called for the use of the sword. Well, not in that verse. In the next video, we'll talk about how he says Jesus never condemned the life, calling, or duty of those who exercise deadly force. Well, we know from philosophy and from debate that the fallacy of the argument from silence, which is a terrible argument. Thank you.